Content warning: the following story contains depictions of suicide and transphobia. Viewer discretion is advised. The story shared with me is one of a family in mourning. Not just in mourning now, but one that has been mourning for nearly 2 decades. From what the Atos family told me, they have been connected to death and ghosts for a long time. For most of the family's history, it was merely a curiosity, sometimes a party trick, sometimes a tragedy, but overall they could define their lives by more than death. However, Tanis Atos is not like most of his family. Meeting him, he is nervous, his eyes shifting from place to place, his leg bouncing while he kept staring just behind me. I can guess what he sees following me, but he is also wise enough to not bring it up. Not to avoid rudeness, but because he is afraid if he acknowledges what follows me, it will instead decide to follow him. He is correct. When I meet him, we discuss about our children briefly. His son and daughter were lucky enough to leave the kingdom behind for the peaceful country of the Triple Alliance. While no country is free of their ghosts, it is not the ghosts that linger the Atos family is afraid of. When we are done talking about our children, it is now time to talk about his ex-girlfriend. When Soraya is mentioned, there is silence in the room. His leg stops bouncing, and his eyes focus at some distant location as he reminisces about his past. Tanis has had a long life, and while he has known life without Soraya a lot longer than he has known life with her, still, it is hard for him to forget the mother of his children. We grew up together, as far as I can tell. We were neighbors, we went to class together, and even at a young age, she had stunning straight hair that everyone was jealous of. Regardless of how hard she played or what she did, her hair stayed straight and neat. It was something I was both jealous of and loved about her. I didn't know when we went from just being friends to dating, but what I did know is by high school, everyone knew us as boyfriend and girlfriend. We were the perfect couple. No fights, a good future together, and we were so in sync that we could plan apart and come together and find out we had the same plans. We thought we had everything figured out. We had perfect plans. It felt like our lives were blessed. We were going to leave Crossroads. We were going to leave the kingdom. We were going to live our lives to the fullest. We had it all figured out at the age of 18. Just 1 year of schooling and we could head to college. Nothing was going to mess it up. While Aphrodite blessed our love life, Hera wanted to bless us just as well. A few years earlier than we were hoping, we started the senior year knowing that Soraya was pregnant, and it just wrecked all of our chances of getting out of Crossroads. The kingdom of Vespucci doesn't allow for abortion, and Soraya's parents forbade the babies from being adopted out of the family, because Soraya wasn't just pregnant, she was pregnant with twins, Dallas and Diana. I love my children so much, and if I could go back and have them again, I would. I just wish they could have been born a few years later. At least let us graduate college first. Being new parents was tough. Being a new parent as a teenager, it is so much fucking harder. In August, Soraya and I had over a dozen colleges accept our applications, at least a few with full ride scholarships. By September, when the news got out that Soraya was pregnant, suddenly those acceptances became rejections. So many letters sent to her, and they were all phrased the exact same way. Due to new information about your personal ethics, behavior, and choices, we have to withdraw our acceptance. And it was Soraya who got rejected, even though it was known I was the father. I wasn't the one losing scholarships, acceptances, and my part-time job. Sure, people would stare at me sometimes, and my dad kept trying to get me to say it was actually a different guy who was the dad. but it was so much worse for Soraya. The only reason Soraya wasn't disowned was because she would have moved in with me and my family. My dad was not happy about the pregnancy, even insisting on a paternity test upon their birth to make sure I was the dad. My mother, on the other hand, was ecstatic. She had set aside a room to be made into a nursery, and she was making plans about me getting married after I graduated, and even plans for having Soraya move in with us. My mom and dad didn't always see eye to eye, but my dad wanted my mom happy. Soraya was in a bad place during the pregnancy. Her top scores dropped to bare averages. I think it was because of the burden on her body distracting her, but also the teachers looking for any reason to punish her. She would get marked down on her essays for mistakes as simple as forgetting a comma, which would give her a 0% on her essay. Her gym teacher would still make her run laps, even with a doctor's note, always forcing her to run lap after lap. And her electives were the worst. No one would want to partner with her, and they would whisper about her, especially when she started to show. She was always the subject of gossip. She would struggle against group projects by herself, where at best she could scrape an average. We were separated, no longer shared any projects together. Our dates pretty much stopped altogether as everything became about the unborn infants. We had to go to doctor appointments, we had to do parenting classes together, or just shopping for new clothes or toys for the babies. I was happy to do it all with her, but there was no longer time for just us, not as individuals, not as a couple. We were now spending all of our time as students or as new parents. I saw how people looked at her when we were together in public, and I knew if I wasn't with her, they would have been so much meaner to her. And Soraya, she got me. I know now about postpartum depression, pregnancy hormones, and even how much stress can affect a person. I now know that she was in pain, she was angry, she was scared, and she was vulnerable, going through one of the hardest things the human body could go through. And she had to face these challenges as a teen with no support from her family, and she was depending on me and my family to get her through it all. Even the most patient person on the planet would be mean or grumpy with all of that happening. However, I didn't know that as a teenager. I was young, I was stupid, and I wasn't enough of a support system for her. I wasn't experienced enough, and even now I wish I could have done more for her. I remember all the late nights where she would spend hours listing everything I was doing wrong. I was leaving laundry in the dryer too long. I wasn't cooking quickly enough. I wasn't cooking enough. She would crave steak, and then an hour later, just the thought of eating steak would nauseate her. And she would get angry at me for eating food that I made for her she no longer wanted. I remember one time I was loading the dishwasher, and she just woke up from her nap. She was 9 months pregnant at that point, and she saw me loading the dishwasher. I smiled at her and said, "Good morning." And she scoffed at me, and she walked out of the house, and she just sat on the porch for 3 hours and wouldn't talk to me during that time, even when I asked her what I did wrong. She told me if I didn't know what I was doing wrong, then I would never be a good dad. It took another 2 hours for me to realize she was upset I was putting plates in the dishwasher first, before the bowls. That was what the issue was. Knowing what I know now, it isn't her fault. As a teenager, it hurt. Being told that you can't be a good dad because of the way you do the dishes makes you feel like either everything is your fault or everything is her fault. And in as much soul searching as I did that day, I blamed myself. I built up resentment, and I kept double and triple checking everything I did just to make sure nothing I did upset her. and even that upset her. She thought I was treating her like a wild animal, and she was right. That was the way I was thinking and treating her. It was hard for her, and it was hard for me too. I wasn't the one she was angry at. I was just the only one she could lash out at. And it was definitely my fault for not using protection that wasn't expired. Still, I remember the day she gave birth. It was less than a week before graduation, and it was night after we drove to 3 different fast food drive-thrus for her cravings. I remember that night specifically. She wanted a burger from O'Daniel's, fries from Jade Bites, and a shake from Shake King. It was one of the few moments of the pregnancy we had that was peaceful, quiet, just the two of us. We drove to a quiet place while we ate and looked up at the stars, one hand on her belly, and the other feeding herself while we looked up. Thank you, Tanis, for everything. I know things are hard, but we can still have a future, she said, and I looked up at the sky with her. We will. I love you. I love our children, and we will get through it, I told her as we watched the sky, and she whispered to me, It is time. We drove to the hospital that night, and I was with her for the first few hours. But by morning time, her parents arrived, and I was asked to leave. She was still a minor at the time, so her parents had the right to say who was or wasn't allowed in the room while she gave birth. I was someone unrelated to her. I wasn't her husband. I wasn't family. So I was pushed out into the waiting room. I didn't know about my babies until hours later when a nurse informed me. Soraya gave birth to 2 healthy baby girls, Diana and Dallas, although Dallas was known as Suna then. He would transition when he was 7, but his mother, her given name was Suna. Soraya thought it would be poetic to name her twin daughters after the sun and moon, and I cried when I heard the news. I cried harder when I was told I wasn't allowed to see them. I was served court documents in the waiting room by Soraya's family lawyer. Apparently, they now wanted full custody of the children, and they didn't want me involved at all. And again, Soraya was still a minor, and she wouldn't be able to fight for custody of her children for months. And even then, it was unlikely for a judge to take her side over her parents. After all, they were successful adults. She was a teen mom who had no college and no future. I asked to at least see Soraya, only to be served a restraining order. Apparently, I wouldn't be allowed to be near her either, not even to call her or talk to her. Even after all of these years later, I am still angry at Soraya's parents for this. They did nothing to help her through the pregnancy, but they had time to prepare to sue for custody over the twins. They had time to prepare a restraining order, but only after I helped Soraya through the pregnancy. It was inherently underhanded and parasitic to me, benefiting off what I did for Soraya, but not wanting to help until after the grandchildren were born. I talked to my mother and father about that. This they saw eye to eye on. They would help me countersue, both for custody over the twins and to emancipate Soraya so she could repeal the restraining order herself. But they also warned me that until that was done, I had to avoid Soraya at school. I had to show the courts that I was making a reasonable effort to respect the law. If Soraya's folks had evidence I was trying to break the law, it would be easier for them to keep custody. I would have to be a model citizen. For the week leading up to graduation, the first few days, Soraya didn't even come to school. On the 4th day, though, she was looking for me. I asked a teacher to explain the restraining order to her, but she kept trying to get me to explain it to her with my own words. And as much as it killed me, and kill me it did, I had to avoid her. If the future I dreamt of living with her and the twins was to be possible, I couldn't see her now. That pain is one I hope you never have to face. I hope you never know what it is like to have to avoid the ones you love because you want to be with them. On the day before graduation, though, she managed to corner me down one of the dead ends in the school's hallways as she screamed her frustrations at me. Knowing what I know now, she had just reached her boiling point. She was postpartum, she was recovering from pregnancy, she was facing stress from her parents, she was forced to still go to school during a time when most would be spending healing, and she lost her boyfriend as far as she could tell. She was angry, she was resentful, she was sad, and all of it spilled out when she cornered me. You weren't there! You weren't there when I gave birth! You weren't there when I went home! You weren't there when I called! You weren't even there when I came to school! Where were you? Where were you when I needed you? Where is the man I fell in love with? She said, crying, with a glance toward the camera before I tried to answer. Soraya, I started before she yelled at me again. Don't fucking bother. I never want to talk to you again. Burn in hell for all I care, she said as she ran off, and I was alone with my feelings. The first thing I could remember feeling was shock. She sought me out for days, only to yell at me and leave me without giving me a chance to explain myself. I was worried she was serious about me never talking to her again, but I convinced myself she was just upset that I would get a chance to talk to her again. I didn't know I was lying to myself. When I came outside, my eyes puffy and red from crying, I saw there was a crowd of people by the bus stop. I had a cold feeling in my gut when I saw the crowd. No, please don't be, I said as I ran to where the crowd was. I pushed my way through, and I could see my worst nightmare. Soraya was on the ground, her neck was at an impossible angle, her limbs were splayed out like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Blood was pooling beneath her, but I couldn't tell where it came from. Already a few people were on their phones calling the vanguard. I dropped to my knees and I held her hand. It was limp and still warm, but something in her hand was gone. Some spark that made her her. It was just meat in my hand, but I still tried talking to her as I held her hand. Tell me what I can do. Tell me how I can make you better. Just tell me right now. I'll do anything. Just stay with me, I said to her body, but her body did not respond. I was vaguely aware of the vanguard arriving, taking her body away. I wasn't allowed to go with her. The EMTs were already made aware of the restraining order by Soraya's family. Even in that moment where she died, I wasn't allowed to tell her goodbye. But that wasn't the end of her story. As she was taken away, I kept staring where her blood was spilled. Even after the janitor poured litter sand over the blood and washed it away, I kept staring there. For hours, it feels like. When I became aware enough to stand up, I saw Soraya again. She was there in the crowd of students, waiting for their bus. Her hair was messy, she was slightly translucent, and she had no shadow, but I recognized her. Hoping against hope that I somehow imagined or hallucinated her death, I ran after her, only to see her turn my way, and I froze. Her eyes. Her eyes were full of hatred, full of rage, full of resentment. So much so that it made every mean moment over the past 9 months seem like a grumpy moment. And after she made eye contact with me, she turned away from me and walked into a wall to disappear. It wasn't the only time I saw her either. When I was graduating, yes, I still walked. My parents insisted I get that moment of normalcy. I saw her in the crowd, her eyes still hateful as she watched me walk across the stage to get my diploma. She was the only one in the entire crowd without robes, the only one who didn't graduate and who would never graduate. I saw her on the steps of the courthouse when my family and I were countersuing for the custody of the twins. Soraya's parents tried convincing the judge I violated the restraining order and caused Soraya's death. However, video evidence showed that she did seek me out despite being told not to. We also called in witnesses like the doctors who recommended that Soraya spend more time recovering since she was struggling badly with postpartum depression and was not thinking straight at the time. The final nail in the coffin was all of the character witnesses who confirmed that I spent Soraya's entire pregnancy supporting her, while her parents did as little as they could. So ultimately, we won custody rights over the twins. I saw Soraya watching us, just behind the judge. The only time she did not look hateful was when she was looking at the twins. She looked forlorn and loving. I could see her reaching out for them, but she could not touch them. I was too close to them, and as much as she loved her children, she hated me more. The next few years were a great challenge, and I admit I wouldn't have made it without my parents' support. My dad warmed up to the idea of being a grandfather, and he helped me get a job at his law firm. I started as a part-time admin assistant, but after getting my degree, I became a lawyer myself. I was able to work from home often, helping my parents help raise the twins, and in time, when they were able to go to school themselves, I was able to finish my degree. I learned a lot from my mother, from everything from how to mend clothing to how to cook for picky eaters. And Soraya was still around, oftentimes watching me from around corners, sometimes getting close to the twins. I could see her, and my parents could see her as well. They confirmed that I went and I left for things like work or shopping. She would play with the children, sometimes by moving toys, sometimes by telling them stories, and sometimes she would even carry them. Her family has a long history of seeing ghosts, and after everything we've been through, we just accepted the fact that Soraya wanted to be in her children's lives after her own death. The first time the twins talked about their mother, they were sent to the therapist. It was a simple thing, a drawing of the family, and the teacher was disturbed by the way they drew Soraya, with messy hair, floating above the ground, and with no shadow, when everyone else had shadows. That was an interesting conversation with the school therapist, and a more interesting conversation with my children. My family has always been able to see ghosts, the departed spirits of those who had, for whatever reason, would not move onto the sunless lands. Most of the time it was a curiosity at best. We could see them, we could talk to them, but they couldn't always talk with us. They could interact with our world and we could interact with them. There was a lot of reasons someone who died might linger, but for Soraya, that answer was clear. She wanted to see her children grow up, and she never got the chance when she was alive. So she would defy the laws of life and death to see her children grow a bit more. And for years, it worked fairly well. Soraya wanted nothing to do with me, but she wanted to see her children. They learned who it was safe to talk about mommy with, and who would think they were either strange or worse. But even if we were an unusual family, Soraya was happy for her children, and happy to be a ghostly mom. As far as I am aware, she never wanted to see her parents anymore. Sometimes they would try to argue for custody of the children, only to lose those court cases rather quickly. Sometimes they would try to drum up sympathy on Share My Day, only to lose it within a week or two. But for the most part, they ignored their grandchildren, except when people began to bug them about why they didn't have grandchildren. I thought about telling them about Soraya. More than once I wanted to call them and just explain that Soraya still endured, but ultimately I decided that wasn't part of the world they could understand, let alone want to be part of. It's hard when you're someone who can see beyond the veil. Some people are just never going to see beyond it. Not because they aren't capable, but because there's someone who would never choose to see beyond it. After all, they couldn't listen to a doctor recommending she rest a while longer after giving birth. I don't think they're going to listen to someone they blame for their daughter's death when they say she's still among us. But all things change, even after death, and sometimes people can be resistant to change. As the twins got older, they explored what kind of people they wanted to be. A part of being a parent that is rarely talked about is when your kids get older, they still need your support and your money, but they also want to express themselves. Barely 7 years old and a cold night like any other, Suna approached me after dinner and asked me very quietly if she could get a short haircut like me. A normal question, you would think, except in both Soraya's family and in my family, women almost never cut their hair. One of the few things that our families had in common. Suna's hair looked so much like her mother's, but in her eyes, I could see both sadness and bravery. The sadness of someone who was expecting her dad to tell her no is something that meant the world to her. The bravery of someone who was preparing to be disappointed and trying not to let her heart break. I told her that she could. I even offered to take her to my barber. She hugged me so tight that night, her tears on my shoulder and my own tears falling down my cheeks. All while Soraya glared at us while peeking around the corner. I know what she imagined Suna and Diana would be like. She told me many times. She imagined two cute girls who would grow up into strong but beautiful women. She imagined going dress shopping with them, braiding their hair, painting their nails, and teaching them what it was to be women in the world. And now here she was, watching as her imagined future was crumbling. Her anger and mourning of her children who never were was distracting her from the joy of the children in front of her. At the barber shop, Suna was the only girl there. I knew my barber from years of experience. He cut my father's hair, and he cut my hair, and I knew he was willing to cut my children's hair. We looked over different hairstyles in the book, and Suna pointed at one style she liked. The same style I had when I was her age. I showed it to the barber, and when he confirmed with me it was okay, he went to work on her hair with the scissors and the clippers. With every snip and every buzz, Soraya's stare grew icier. I could tell she wanted to rip the scissors and clippers out of his hands, and she would have if not for the little silver I carried with me. A little charm on a leather necklace. Something to keep ghosts from harming me, or those close to me. I hated using it against Soraya because she was once someone I loved, someone I imagined growing old with. But after 7 years, I had changed. She hadn't. When Suna's haircut was done, her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. She was even happier than during her birthday. As she looked over herself in the mirror, she called out, "I look just like you, Daddy." And as she said that, the hand mirror on the other side of the room was violently thrown against the wall. Soraya couldn't harm me, but she made it very clear how displeased she was with me. She wanted her daughters to look like her, and with Soraya's familiar hair now on the ground to be swept up, and Suna did look more like me with her hair cut short. The barber apologized for the mess, and I reassured him as I paid for Suna's haircut in the mirror. Even if the barber didn't know about the ghosts, I knew that look in his eye, and he knew the look in my eye. If I was apologizing and I was paying for something, it was because it was my fault, and he knew enough not to ask questions he didn't want answers for. He still welcomed us back any time. After the haircut, Suna and I got ice cream and window shopped around Old Town. It was a peaceful place and it always had something worth looking at. Suna's face lit up a few different times when the shopkeepers referred to her as my son. When I corrected the first shopkeeper, her face dropped. I didn't correct the shopkeepers after that, and I had a feeling, call it a paternal instinct, or maybe it was just my father's stories about men like Dylan Dyson. But I took Suna to the tailor my father and I would go to. I told Suna that her birthday was coming up, and I wanted to know what clothes she wanted. Her eyes were shining like miniature suns, and her smile lit up the entire shop. There wasn't a lot of clothes in her size, but she was gleaming to get a suit made for her size. Well, not quite a suit, but it was pants and a button-up shirt with a tie. Something Soraya never would have dreamed of her daughters wearing. We found a few things Suna liked, and I asked her if she wanted a different name. He chose the name Dallas, one of the brands he liked, and we agreed he would need more clothes. His old dresses would go to his sister since they wore the same size, but he was so excited to have so many new clothes, and he wanted to look just like his dad and his papa. That day, when we took Dallas home, we explained to the family, and everyone accepted it pretty quickly. And by the time the twins turned 8 years old, everyone had fully accepted Dallas as Dallas. Everyone, that is, except Soraya. Her hauntings around Dallas started small at first. It was something like moving a dress that belonged to Diana, leaving it on Dallas's bed, or placing a book on Dallas's bed, and how to be a proper young lady. Things that could be put away, but I could tell it hurt Dallas. Then it began to escalate. On the twins' 10th birthday, all of Dallas's gifts were destroyed during the night. His clothes, his books, his toys, even his video games and his bike were all destroyed. Hundreds of centi worth of gifts. And the heartbreak on both Dallas and Diana's faces is not something I would wish on anyone. Diana's gifts were untouched, but her brother's was destroyed. Dallas had proof in front of him that his mother didn't accept him as her son, and that she was willing to destroy his things if he decided to be himself. A demand from the ghostly companion to be someone he wasn't, or she would destroy everything around him. And the warning to Diana was also harsh. Her things were untouched, because she was behaving the way Soraya wanted her to behave. Soraya could have, just as easily, punished Diana, but Diana was the golden child, for now at least. But she could just as easily turn on her, and now Diana would live with this knowledge that the only reason she wasn't targeted was because Soraya had another target. That isn't a thought you want in your children's minds, especially when they were 10 years old. So that day, instead of opening gifts and eating cake, my parents and I taught Dallas and Diana how to make wards, sigils, and charms to keep ghosts out of their space and away from them. Soraya seethed outside of the house that day because she was locked out of the house for the first time. The twins sculpted their first wards into their jewelry, and I promised Dallas we would replace his gifts as soon as we could. And for years, Soraya was just a distant shade, someone who stared at me hatefully from a distance, but who was powerless to harm me or my family. Just another day that ended in Y. But as the twins got older, Diana began to get distant from the family. She would spend more and more nights out. Sometimes she would let us know where she was. Usually she didn't. She would disappear, her grades would suffer, and she would look worse and worse when we did see her. Her face was growing pale and thin, her eyes had dark circles, and she rarely spoke to anyone except to yell at them. She would yell at me for everything from the way I looked, the way I spoke, and once she even yelled at me that she wished that I was the one who died and not her mother. I wasn't sure what to try. She wouldn't talk to me when I reached out to her, and she only grew more isolated when I left her alone. I know whatever was happening, it wasn't normal school problems. Dallas said she didn't talk to anyone at school, and as far as he could tell, she wasn't talking to any grown adults who could be grooming her. Our biggest clue at what was wrong was the first time she was taken to the hospital. When she was at school, she apparently stood up in class and she was swaying in place before she fainted. Thankfully, Vanguard was able to get to her in time. And at the hospital, we were told that she was malnourished badly. They had to feed her by IV to get her back to a point where she could move again. And the worst part? The entire time, she kept begging the hospital to just let her starve. She wanted to die, and she said she wanted to see her mother. Her ward was broken by herself, so she wasn't safe from Soraya, and it seemed that Soraya was affecting her badly. When Diana had a chance to calm down, I asked her, privately, what was happening. I told her no matter what, I loved her, but I needed to know what was happening if I was going to help her. And it took some time, but she did tell me what was happening. Apparently, she broke her talisman about a year ago because she wasn't making friends at school, and she felt so lonely that she thought she could make friends with her mother. She figured that Soraya was her mother, and surely she wouldn't harm her. And for a while, they were friends. Soraya helped Diana in school, she kept her company, and even gave her someone to talk to. But as time went on, things got darker and darker. Soraya would ask Diana things like, "Do you love me?" When Diana reassured Soraya that she did, Soraya would ask her to prove it. It was little things at first, like leaving a candle out for Soraya, or burning a few bites from her meal so Soraya could eat it from the smoke. But then it started escalating. Soraya asked Diana to stay out later and later, sometimes spending entire nights from dusk until dawn, just talking about whatever Soraya wanted. Or Soraya started asking Diana to burn all of her food for her. She would tell Diana that she was so hungry that she felt like she was dying every moment. The only thing that would make the pain stop was burning food. It couldn't just be food she stole or found. It had to be food made for Diana, and Diana couldn't eat because it made Soraya uncomfortable because she couldn't eat. In time, every action Diana took had to be done to make Soraya happy. Diana had to read the right books, watch the right films, listen to the right music, and have the right conversations with her mother. Diana couldn't sleep under the covers anymore because Soraya was cold all the time. Diana couldn't talk to the living because Soraya couldn't. Diana wasn't allowed to feel happy because Soraya couldn't feel happy. It was parasitic, it was toxic, it was abusive, and Diana didn't realize until it was nearly too late. Apparently, Soraya recently told Diana that if Diana just stopped eating altogether, then when she died, she would be a ghost alongside Soraya. As Diana spoke to me, Soraya stared at us from the hallway, unable to get close because I was close by. But I cannot tell you how angry I was. My daughter was convinced she had to give up her life because her mother didn't get to live a life. Soraya convinced Diana that she was obligated to give up her life for her dead mother. I told Diana she didn't need to give up her life for anyone, not for Soraya, not for me, not even for Dallas. It was her life to live, and just because someone else was denied their life didn't mean that hers was forfeit. Soraya's death wasn't her fault, and Soraya being a ghost wasn't her fault either. It took Diana a long time to recover. Physically, it took a few weeks. It took years for her to recover mentally. She went to the hospital 3 more times, each time when she broke her word to talk to Soraya again, thinking this time would be the time that her mother would finally be a good friend or mother to her. And each time, Soraya convincing Diana that harming herself was helping her mother. I remember all the times when she would just start doing something she liked and her smile would just drop, suddenly struck by guilt because she was happy. She was happy when someone close to her wasn't, and she felt like it was her being selfish for not offering comfort to Soraya. It was a journey explaining boundaries to her and helping her understand that it wasn't her responsibility to always be there for everyone else just because they needed her. It's something even adults struggle with, and fundamentally, in Diana's heart, she wanted to help people, and the struggles of the world always seemed like they always needed more from her. So we found ways she could help people in tangible ways, but also in a way with boundaries. So we tried to have her volunteering to tutor young children at the library. It brought a smile to her face because it meant there was time where she was helping people, but they couldn't approach her at all hours of the day. And it wasn't people asking her to give up things for them. They needed her to help, and at the end of the day, they could go home. Still, though, she was worn out in a way she never fully recovered from. You couldn't imagine most people as genuinely needing help. She could only see potential manipulations. Someone begging for change became someone who wasn't actually starving, but someone who wanted to see if they could pay for beer just by begging. A child who struggled week to week to write their own name wasn't someone struggling with dyslexia. They were someone who were going to refuse to do their homework. Or a crying baby at the store wasn't someone who was upset. The baby was someone who was trying to make her angry specifically. Things got a little better for Diana, but I honestly think if it wasn't for Soraya, that Diana could have been a hero. I think Soraya only cared about what she lost, not what Diana lost. By the time she was graduating from high school, she wanted to be an office administrator. She couldn't imagine helping people professionally anymore. The most she could hope for was neutrality, data entry, paperwork, and computer work. Any work that minimized her human contact. But at least there was a future for her. Dallas was still figuring out what he wanted to do as he was graduating. He was willing to take a gap year and work at JRT Law Firm as a courier. Well, he thought about it. He was still willing to help people, but he was also scared of being hurt. Unlike Diana, he still had a desire to be a hero, even if he wasn't ready. Even if he never was a hero, just the fact he was willing to try, and he had that standard inside of himself was going to mean he would help change the world. In the months leading up to the graduation, we had increasing issues with Soraya. She couldn't get into the house, she couldn't get close to us, but she was still able to do things like leave nails and broken glass on the roads and sidewalks we walked. These weren't direct harm against us, they could have harmed anyone, and they weren't just affecting us. By this point, Soraya was less of a memory of the girl she once was, and she was now something else entirely. One of the hardest parts about dealing with ghosts like Soraya was they were neither a perfect victim nor a perfect monster. People tend to put ghosts in those two categories. The perfect victim is someone you can empathize with, someone you want to protect, someone who had something bad happen to them, something undeserved, and they did nothing wrong in life or in death. Someone who needs protecting, who needs to be protected from the living, who just don't understand the suffering of the dead. Someone who is always the victim in every situation, and who has done no wrong, or if they have done wrong, it is justified in a way that is understood. But that wasn't Soraya. She also wasn't the perfect monster either. Didn't have no reason to be hateful. Didn't have no reason to hate me. She hurt her children in two very different ways that permanently changed them, but she didn't do it because she woke up one day and decided to be an evil ghost. She had her reasons for doing what she did. In her eyes, she did it for love, and she had every reason to hurt us. She never got a chance to grow up. She never got a chance to be loved in the way her children were, and she never got a chance to be a mother to her children. She was a shadow over her children, a reminder of a young girl who never got a chance to be a woman, a mother who was never a mother to them. They had sympathy for Soraya once, but it turned sour, and now she was a nuisance at best and a threat at worst. Any positive associations they had with Soraya was now also tainted with the fact that she hurt them. It turned sour, and it was, in a way, a reflection of what Soraya's emotions also became. She loved me. She loved all of us. Once. That love was now tainted, corrupted, and twisted into a very dark emotion. And by this point, I could no longer pretend it wasn't there anymore. I cared for Soraya once, and I cared for her still, or at least I cared for who she once was. Still, though, it wouldn't be good for our children if she was still around. That is another experience I hope no one ever has to go through. The knowledge of knowing that someone you love is bad for others you love. Still, with this knowledge, I told my children that I thought Soraya was bad for us all to keep her around, and that we would need to get rid of her. When I shared this thought, it was like the floodgates opened. Diana and Dallas shared so many stories of what she did to make things just a living hell for them. She would write horrible words on their lockers, or she would torment their friends with horrible night terrors so they would be exhausted, and just the guilt of knowing it was their fault was keeping them up at night. She would need to go, but making ghosts move on who didn't want to move on wasn't a skill I had, nor anyone else in the family. What I did have, though, was a contact who'd been collecting lost souls since the old days. He agreed to collect Soraya. However, he would be there only a few hours before the twins' graduation. Still, though, when they knew that Soraya's days were now numbered, their mood improved, and on the day of the graduation, it was time to say goodbye to Soraya. Dallas was the first to say goodbye, handing his talisman to his sister as he approached Soraya. What he said to her was said quietly enough that I couldn't hear it, but I could see the tears in his eyes as he spoke to the stone-faced spirit, and when he was done, he hugged her, and she hugged him back. I could see a flicker of the old Soraya on her face until it was replaced by stoicism once again, and Dallas collected both his charm and his sister's talisman from her. Her words with Soraya were a lot less quiet, but I could tell she was furious. Her hands were shaking, her voice quavering, her tears were streaming, and I think she would have struck Soraya if her fist wouldn't have fell through the ghost. Still, Diana's voice got louder and louder until finally she got really quiet, and she gripped Soraya close while she whispered one last thing to her mother. Something that caused a flicker of pure rage to show on the ghost's face before she turned stoic again. And Diana took a step back, collecting her charm. It was now my turn to face Soraya. I left my protective charm with my children as I spoke to Soraya directly for the first time in years. I know you told me to never speak to you again, but before I had a chance to say anything else, she embraced me. Her hands gripped around the back of my head and her cold head pressed against my chest, her freezing cold breath causing me to shiver as I heard her speak. I never forgave you, and I will never forgive you, she said as her grip around my head tightened and she tried to twist my neck. I'm sorry, Soraya. Someday I will forgive you, I said as there was a loud bang and Soraya's eyes widened and she let go of me, her hand touching her back, pulling back pale white ectoplasm from where the silver bullet entered her body. Her shocked face processing the fact for the first time in over a decade, she felt physical pain. Her body dissolved into vapor. Her last moments of awareness of the soulful lands was pain as she dissolved and the silver bullet fell to the ground, collected by a man in a bandana and a hat. Sorry about the shooting early, partner. I figured you wouldn't mind too much, Ghost Hunter said, as I agreed, and I hurriedly paid him his fee, a silver coin, and he collected the bullet, the other part of his fee, a tithe he owed to his master, a soul collected for another year of life for him, a soul that would be carried by Vanth into the sunless lands that came after death. There, maybe Soraya could be happy, or at the very least, she could be where she was supposed to be. Ghost Hunter did not stay long, and for the first time in their entire lives, the twins were free from their mother's shadow and legacy. At their graduation, they collected their diplomas, and they could sit down without checking their seats for nails. And after the graduation, we could drive in the car without worrying about broken glass on the street. And when we went out for dinner, we could eat without worrying about poison being mixed in. It was quiet. It was peaceful. We realized we were carrying more weight than we could have known until it was finally gone. We loved Soraya, and we could still love her with her gone. But for now, we just felt relief she was gone, and we could move on with our lives without a feeling of guilt that she didn't have a chance to live life with us. We had a life, and she was given a second chance to still be a part of our lives. But rather than seeing it as a gift, she grew envious of what she could never have again, and she became a monster we had to let go. I hope that when judgment catches up to me, that they can understand why I did what I did, and if what I did was wrong, then I will face my judgment with my head held high, because I did what was best for my children. I thank Mr. Atos for his time and sharing his story. It is a hard story for him to share, even if it is one that is finished. He asks me if I think he did the right thing or not. He asks me if it is even a place for the living to dictate that the dead are supposed to move on to the sunless lands, especially if they were lingering. Instead of answering, I asked him a question. Imagine instead of your ex, the ghost was a total stranger. A stranger who played with your children, who tore up your son's clothing, who convinced your daughter to commit suicide, who spent years trying to get you and your children into horrible accidents, because they were envious of your life and wanted it to end. A stranger who hated you so much they wouldn't talk to you for over a decade while they stalked you. A stranger whose envy, anger, and hate was so strong that it defied death itself, just for another chance to harm you and your family. Now, I want you to ask yourself, did you do the right thing by sending the stranger away? The question satisfies Mr. Athos.